no one's going to employ you if they think you have an uncontrollable urge to gamble. 70% of people with severe gambling problems commit a white-collar crime.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.
What is up, everybody? I am Jason Trost, the host of the Business of Betting podcast. I'm joining you today representing Northwestern. First of all, I'm getting ready for the season. As my producer Thomas pointed out, we are undefeated this year, and I'm very excited about that. Today, we have a great guest, Keith Whyte from Safer Gambling Strategies, as the president of that organization. I'm very excited to have Keith on because we talk about sports betting all the time, and we touch on a little bit on the morality of sports betting. But Keith has worked closely with addicts and people have taken sports betting too far, and he advises gambling commissions on the right processes and policies. So it's an area that I think we as an industry don't talk enough about. So I'm very excited to get into the weeds on betting addiction, what we should do about it. And so thanks for joining the pod, Keith.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Jason. Glad to be here.
So why don't you just give a quick background on how you came into this and how you learned about the space of problem gambling, gambling addiction, sports betting addiction?
Sure. Yeah, like most of us, I didn't necessarily grow up in the industry, but I was working in Washington, D.C. in 1996 when the American Gaming Association was being formed, and I was one of their first staffers. I became the director of research for the AGA from 96 to 98. And so that gave me a really interesting window into that first expansion of legalized gambling in America. And then in 1998, I became the National Council on Problem Gambling as their executive director. I was there 27 years and just left in January of this year to start Safer Gambling Strategies. It's a consultancy, as you say, that focuses on not just advising governments, but corporations and organizations on responsible gambling policy, how we can all minimize harm and maximize benefit.
Why don't we zoom out, take a high-level view? Why don't you define problem gambling, gambling addiction, sports betting addiction? Because I imagine just even that might mean different things to different people. So why don't we start with there? Let's start in the basics.
Oh, it really does. And I think, a friend of mine, Dr. Jennifer Shatley at Roga, really makes a really good point that you have to define the problem gambling and responsible gambling are two really different concepts. So problem gambling or people with gambling problems are those who are suffering from the addiction of gambling. They meet at least four of nine clinical criteria, and they are people that you commonly think of as being out of control. Responsible gambling is for people who do not have a gambling problem. And so that's the 97, 98% of Americans or 98% of, Brits. Those are people who are gambling without serious harm. But there's a middle ground, that these things are on a continuum. There are some people with gambling problems who have not very severe problems. There are some people that are gambling responsibly, but are starting to show little signs. They're not two binary states. There's a little bit of fudge in the middle, and people move back and forth. But the two concepts are very distinct. So responsible gambling policies are things like setting limits, in a cold state, if you will. Problem gamblers are folks that they can't stick to those limits. And so they need a different set of conditions and circumstances.
So I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I've never heard this 9 checklist. Can you give me the 9 items? Do you have them off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, but it loads on 3 major things: preoccupation, loss of control, and harm. And so this is the American Psychiatric Association's, medical manual, and gambling disorders is classified in there. And so things like preoccupation, it's fascinating for people that are really into gambling. This is a hard criteria to struggle with. But preoccupation, what I like to say is it's someone who, if you can go on vacation for a couple of days and not constantly be checking your phone, even if you're not betting, you have to be able to turn it off. But a lot of people that are seriously into gambling are pretty preoccupied. So loss of control is probably the thing that separates people with gambling problems from people who don't have gambling problems. Because if you can set a limit and then walk away when you're done, or if even if it's a high limit, if you're able to control your gambling, you're probably not having a problem.
When I go on holiday, I keep checking work emails. Does that mean I have a work problem?
That's preoccupation in a different space, but that's one of the reasons why you need to hit more of those criteria. And you also have to look at frequency. If you're preoccupied just during, March Madness, that's one thing. If you're preoccupied all the time with your gambling, your wins and your losses, that's a different thing. So yeah, so preoccupation, loss of control, tolerance gets in there because if we could just bet $5 and they get that same excitement, that'd be one thing. But just like people with substance abuse problems, you develop tolerance. People with gambling problems need to bet more and more money to achieve that same high. And gambling, unlike substance abuse, you can't overdose. There's never enough. You can always double. You can always bet more. So tolerance is a really interesting thing. But we can see in the brain. For an addict, a $50,000 bet just does nothing. It needs to be 500 or whatever that is.
I appreciate you have more of a policy background than a medical background, but can you comment on how a gambling addiction is similar or not similar to other addictions, whether it's alcohol or sex or, drugs, or is it similar pathology or is it pretty different?
It's a great question. So the brain of a problem gambler looks almost identical to the brain of a cocaine addict. The same areas of the prefrontal cortex are deadened, and the same areas, the excitement centers of the brain, are highly activated. So we know that there is some brain chemistry involved, even though there's no external substance. But you're right, Jason, there's a big difference between gambling addiction and, say, cocaine addiction, and that there's not a substance involved. And so it does that. The analogy breaks down. It's much like drug addiction. There's a kind of a biological, a genetic factor. So by that, I mean, if you have someone in your immediate family who had a drug abuse problem, you're much more likely to have a drug abuse problem yourself. Same thing with gambling. Roughly 30 to 60% of the risk is genetic. That's not destiny. Just because your father had a gambling problem doesn't mean you will. It just means you're at higher risk. And some of that risk is because it's, your brain is wired a little bit differently. But then there's environment. There's what you choose to do, why you choose to do it. I think the biggest factor that differs between gambling addiction and other addictions is that lack of substance, because gambling addicts don't have that same explanation, that same excuse. We understand, you're not a bad person. It's the cocaine that causes changes in your brain. And if you stop using, you can come back to a normal way of living. Gambling addicts, the closest analog is money. Money is sort of the substance they abuse. And if you take the money away, it doesn't stop the craving. So it's clinically, it's very similar. Psychologically, it's very, very similar. But the role of money and the role of lack of external substance, those are the things that are different.
And you mentioned father. That made me think, what percentage of gambling addicts are female?
Male is a big risk factor for gambling addiction. It's roughly 60-40, although there's a growing number of female problem gamblers, but it's mainly machines and non-strategic forms of gambling. Guys, we tend to prefer strategic forms of gambling. Poker, racing in the old days, certainly sports betting, trading, those are much more.
I don't do much on the casino side. Do you have those stats specific to sports betting? Do you know what the breakdown is by sex in sports betting by chance?
My former organization, NSPG, just published a big study of about 3,000 Americans. But males in the United States right now, males dominate sports betting. I think it's probably 80-20. And so you'd assume that the addiction kind of skews that way too. The highest risk group right now for sports betting problems is young men 18 to 34. They have the highest rates of participation and likely the highest rates of problems. It's somewhere around, and frequency is really important here. So most recreational sports bettors, most casual sports bettors do not have a problem. But if you're betting every day, roughly 15% of people who bet sports every day show signs of gambling problem. I mean, it's, but that's a pretty rare distribution. That's a pretty high frequency.
And while we're laying the scene for this, is there a big difference in the pathology between gambling addiction with sports betting versus blackjack versus slots versus poker, or are the pathologies very similar?
Yeah, it's very, very similar. I mean, there are some really, really tiny minor differences when it comes to, things like difference between a strategic game and a non-strategic game, or, your choice. But most of those fall aside. It's a little bit like when we talk to someone who has an alcohol problem, we're not concerned as much whether it's beer they're drinking or vodka or a particular type of vodka. There are differences and implications, but they're pretty minor. It does, in recovery, it gets interesting. So if you're trying to stay off the bet in your sports betting, and in the United States right now, it's hard to watch any sports because you're going to be bombarded with ads. That's a little bit different. And the ease of which you can place a sports bet now, the technology has made that easier, but the technology can also be protective. And that's one of the things we talked about a little bit, Jason, is that, technology is neutral. It's how you use it to either increase risk or to, minimize harm. And so there's a lot of neat RG tech coming out. But yeah, no, so to your point, the differences in types of gambling are important, but not as much when you look. The other thing I'll say, Jason, real quick, is that most people with gambling problems are not single form gamblers. They gamble on everything. And in fact, that's one of the bigger predictive factors. If you're gambling on 7 or more activities with a lot of frequency, or 10 or more activities with a lot of frequency, you're much, much more likely to have a problem. It's rare that you see just somebody who only plays the slots.
Yeah, all in. One of my favorite podcast hosts is Scott Galloway from Prof G, and he always talks about sport. He thinks sports betting is the worst form of addiction because the person who's addicted can hide it so easily. If you're an alcoholic, you smell like alcohol. Right. If you have a cocaine addiction, you might be over energetic. All this sort of like standard societal addictions in theory are detectable, where he says with a betting addiction or a gambling addiction, you can go a long time and nobody is the wiser because your human body is the same, but you're just spinning out of control. Do you think there's truth to that? Do you think gambling addiction is the worst type of addiction because it's easier to hide?
Absolutely. We call it the hidden addiction because there are a few outward physical signs. And we know, and we've surveyed this a lot, that it's much more heavily stigmatized than other addiction. It's harder for people to understand. There's a lot more religious and moral shame and stigma. It means people with gambling problems are much less likely to seek treatment. When they do seek treatment, their problems are much worse. If you're an alcoholic and let's say you try and get clean and sober, yeah, you may have damaged your liver, but you're still employed. Most people with gambling problems, when they seek help, they have gambling debt alone, twice their average annual income. And so, at least in the United States, getting into recovery when you owe hundreds of thousands of dollars of unsecured debt, sometimes to bookies and other folks, that's a lot different story, because you're homeless. You've lost your marriage. No one's going to employ you if they think you have an uncontrollable urge to gamble. 70% of people with severe gambling problems commit a white-collar crime. So they're packed in there is a lot of stuff. We celebrate people who've recovered, from an opioid addiction. We're like, that you're strong. That's so awesome. A, we know they stopped using that substance. And B, like you can prove it. It goes back to the hidden addiction part. Like you can urine test somebody. Yeah, Jason's not using opioids anymore. Great job. We really applaud you. I can tell you all day long, I'm not sports betting anymore. And literally while we're on this podcast, I could have a ton of money down on Asian table tennis and, all the other ridiculous things. So it's harder and no one can prove that I'm not, because you can't test my blood. So that, again, there's more shame and stigma. It's harder for people to understand this addiction versus substance abuse. And it makes recovery difficult. It makes becoming a sort of healthy, productive member of society again. There's a lot more barriers for folks that develop a gambling problem than other addictions.
So as somebody, you've been deep in the space for what, 20, 25 years?
Yeah, almost 30 now. Yeah.
You have a platform, like I would say a lot of people that listen to this are very into the industry or they're executives at operators or B2B providers in and around sports betting. What do you want them to know about betting addiction or gambling addiction? Let's shine the light on it. Here's your spotlight. How would you destigmatize this?
Problem gambling is a negative, but it's a small but serious problem. Responsible gambling is such a positive. Safer gambling, consumer protection, whatever you want to call it. That's something that the entire industry can get behind and talk about more. But it's got to be sincere. It's got to be authentic. You can absolutely do well by doing good, especially in this industry. But we have to admit, yes, there are going to be some people, sometimes even VIPs, sometimes some of your best customers that may have problems. Helping them get the help they need is okay, because if you do, you can build a sustainable ecosystem with a ton of non-problem customers. And gambling is a rules-bound, heavily regulated space. So getting the responsible gambling part right, means everything with reputation. I even talk when we do training, we train employees a lot. I can't tell you the number of employees I've trained who've said, I love this industry. I love this job. I love working in sports betting, but I don't think my management has my back. They say that they want me to be responsible, but they really don't. And so I'm thinking of leaving, thinking of quitting. I would tell my friends not to work in this industry. And then you do a training with someone where there's, the CEOs there, there's corporate support. They actually want you to be responsible. And these they love it. They love being in this industry. Same thing with customers. I talk to a lot of people with gambling problems. And when someone with a severe gambling problem is able to say, you know what, Keith, one of the reasons that I got help is because my host pulled me aside and said, you know what, I think maybe you should take a break. That word of mouth is gold I mean, imagine being two CEOs. One, you've got same person with gambling problems. The one guy comes out and says, you know what? Thank you. Your employee really helped me. I lost a ton of money, but now I'm good. And I don't have any blame. I appreciate that, I came into your property. I took my chances. I lost, but when I needed help, someone helped me. And then you've got the other problem gambler who said, you know what? I was begging for help. I was crying at the table. And all your folks did is just, pulled out as much money as they could and kicked me in the curb. Like, which of those two stories do you want your customers to tell? And I mean, I think from just a consumer perspective, it's an easy one, but it seems, it's not common across our industry.
Well, you got a gambling CEO right in front of you. So let's go through this, because I'm always like, from a philosophical, like if we took the morality out of this, philosophically, I get very confused as to where the responsibility lay. I mean, in general, society puts the responsibility in alcoholism on alcoholics. We don't, unless somebody has too much to drink at a bar, we don't expect the bartender to check somebody's alcohol history before. And I doubt many cocaine dealers are doing the same. And you can go down the list of other addictions. I can't, philosophically, mind you, not morally, I can't really think of any other industries that are responsible for policing their customers from using their product. Maybe there is. Maybe medicine is an example of, like, you can't use as much pharmaceuticals as you want. But anyway, like, philosophically, can you break this down from first principles as to, because like if you had two extremes of a like laissez-faire, eat all you can eat, gamble all you want, full spectrum on one side. The other one is like hand-holdy, super friendly, low limits, huggy time, right? Obviously that the true answer is somewhere in the middle. But philosophically, I find the idea of where do you draw that line incredibly complicated. And also, sports betting is a zero-sum game. So the best customers are the ones that lose the most money. And so there's an incentive to not do responsible gambling other than feel goods and regulation, which is probably why you're employed and people keep asking you for ideas on how to implement this stuff. But I don't know. Can you break this down, like leaving morality aside from it? Or maybe you can't. But can you give me like a first principles basis on how you think an operator and governments and the world should approach the balance between a nanny state and do whatever you want?
Yeah, you totally can. But Jason, it's a great question. It's a question that I would say is not fully answered yet. But what I would say, I'd go back to your first principle. Yes, individual responsibility has to be the majority of the responsibility, right? It's, you take that on yourself. You've got to be responsible for yourself. So no question. The operator has a role. I want to assign a percentage, but it's not the majority. The majority is held by the individual. Operator's got a role. The regulator's got a role. So call it, 60, 20, 20, right? Something like that. And so then, yeah, when you break it down, I think it's good to say it's on that continuum between, total laissez-faire and total, overprotection. Society tries to find that balance. How much is too much? There's always an age limit around gambling, right? Society has always clearly said children should not be betting. What that age limit is, though, that's the art. That's the real discussion. Is it 18? Is it 21? Is it 25? I don't know. I mean, I think it's generally 21, the majority of the countries. So fine. Does that mean that there's some 20-year-olds that we're probably prohibiting from betting that could totally handle it? Yes. But that's where society is drawing the line. It's never perfect. And research can help. But then I do think from that first principle, the other first principle is that generally in every society I'm aware of around the world, gambling is prohibited unless it's allowed. So it's not like opening a restaurant, which you can do unless you can't. Almost every society I know says, especially commercial gambling is not a regular business activity. So from those two principles, it's a regulated activity that's prohibited unless it's legalized, and that society generally agrees that, there's a minimum age. Then the art of responsible gambling is trying to find that balance between, minimizing harm and maximizing revenue. And, it's a dynamic thing. What is the duty of care? But so I would go back to, I think the best analogy here real quick is alcohol. Bartenders, you're right, do not check your genetic predisposition. They don't ask you if you've got a gambling problem. But in the United States, the Dram-Stock law, the duty of care says that they are responsible for over-serving you. So they don't have to know anything about you as a person. They have to know that if you have more than 5 drinks in an hour, an average male, more than 5 drinks in an hour will make you legally drunk. So they know that, and there's a legal duty of care, And they also know that they're personally responsible for over-serving if there's a negative consequence. Gambling, we don't have exactly a duty of care yet, but we're coming ever closer to one. And so once you get that bright line, then operators know, and individuals know, I have to take responsibility for my own actions unless the operator is doing something that's egregious. Or, vice versa. The customer may be doing something that's egregious. So your responsibility, once that's a little bit more clearly defined, I think that helps everybody understand the rules of the game.
Just a few comments on that. I like your 60-20-20 breakdown. I don't know if that means anything in practice, but it feels good. In terms of age, I think the United States, I'm sure I'm wrong on this in a few countries, but pretty much the United States is the only country that uses this 21 number for alcohol and everything else. I think in most of the world it's 18. So in the UK it's 18. Kalshi is 18 now. The 21-year-old thing is an American thing. And in terms of duty of care, the United Kingdom has that standard of duty of care. So that's something we've been dealing with over here. The problem I have with this stuff, and maybe it's just necessarily gray and complicated, is that even though I think the regulation from the government is good faith, it kind of makes everything more expensive, decreases consumer choice, increases the cost of operations. And ultimately, even though it's a good faith regulation, which probably applies to a lot of regulation, even outside of gambling, it just makes things more expensive, more complicated, and everybody's worse off for it. And I think in the UK, I don't think we really have done this too much in the United States, but in the UK, they're really expecting the operator to operate as not like necessarily to a clinical level, but you have to go really deep in assessing somebody's psychological state. And also we have to go to a very, very uncomfortable depth on source of funds and if they have the money to lose. And so we have a principle, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but we have this working principle that somebody's allowed to lose X percent of their salary per year. It's kind of trying to find that gray zone, but why isn't it that plus 5%? Why isn't it that minus 5%? In terms of your alcoholic example of over-serving, that works in that context because men can have X number of units, women can have roughly Y number of units based on your body weight, yada, yada, yada. That doesn't exist in sports betting because a billionaire can bet $500,000 and be fine, and a homeless person can bet $10 and be broke. So you can't have this kind of, there's no unit that would apply to sports betting that is easily to measure for the bartender in this case.
Agreed. Yeah, and that's where it breaks down.
I don't have any solutions, but it feels so nebulous, and my analytical computer science brain has really trouble. Politically, I'm fairly lefty. I want the government to make sure that products are safe for people. I'm not a libertarian, which believes if it doesn't kill you, it's fine. I believe that good faith regulation, making sure things are working. That's the way I want my government to behave. But at least in my industry, I think, at least in the UK, and I think the US screws up different regulation. It's largely absent in terms of responsible gambling, as far as I can tell. It's about 20 years behind the UK. But in the UK, it's really expensive. Bill Gurley says it rewards, it's regulatory capture. It basically rewards big companies because they can afford all these RG people. It makes it hard for startups like us to exist in this space. So that's a long-winded response to say, I hear what you're saying, but I don't feel any better about the situation.
That's fair. Well, and I think being in the UK, it's a lot different. I mean, so culture matters, and a social welfare country like the UK is going to approach gambling regulation, frankly, a lot differently than a capitalist country like the United States. So I think you're right. The United States is behind in RG. I think there's a lot of innovation coming, and it's coming from the private sector. RG in the United States is led by the industry and by NGOs. It's not led by government at all. Government is far behind. And I'm probably speaking, preaching to the choir here, but I think generally private sector and NGOs working together can be a lot more efficient and effective. They're a lot more nimble. They're flexible. And so I think, the approach in the United States is much more voluntary compliance, like companies themselves go working together to set a high standard rather than waiting for 50 different states to impose all these different standards. So yeah, I think those differences, I think what you're going to see in the United States is a much more flexible market-based system. In UK, other social welfare countries, you're going to see a lot more government oversight of the system. So we'll see 10, 20 years, we'll see how that works out.
When you say social welfare, are you talking about it from the perspective that the government regulates more things, or you have a national health service that people can fall back into?
Yeah, mainly national health. So social welfare, it's a kind of an economic political concept.
Different governing philosophy? Yeah, I would say even though it is, I wouldn't call it. I guess the UK has more of a social net than the US does for sure. But I still think if you need to use the NHS, the public health service for betting addiction, I think it's going to be very, very tough. I think the
Oh, yeah.
NHS is woefully, I mean, it's woefully understaffed and under resourced for, if you cut your leg, let alone mental health disorders. I mean, just like the rest of the world, like the mental health disorders is very hard to access that, even if you pay for it. And I don't think you can. I know the NHS does some gambling addiction stuff, but in general, it's very, 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 very small. So even though they have social medicine here,
There's a lot of concern in the field that with the recent reforms, almost all the gambling tax monies for prop gambling in the UK is going to go into NHS, which I think everyone agrees is not currently doing the job that most of the charities are doing now. So the UK is undergoing a great experiment. Most of their problem gambling funds are moving from the charitable, the NGO sector into NHS. And I think in 5 years or so, we'll see what those outcomes are. But Jason, I mean, I'm a big believer in risk-based regulation and an outcome-based policy. So, New Jersey is a great example of that. In RG in New Jersey, every operator has to submit a plan, how they're going to meet the regulatory requirements. The regulator doesn't say this is how you have to do it. It just says, show us the outcome. We'll monitor that. So Caesar's going to do it in one way, MGM's going to do it a different way. And the risk-based regulation means that, lotteries probably get a lot lighter oversight than online sports betting. You look at where the risk is, and not that online sports betting per se is much more addictive. It's just research shows that there's people that engage in it with high frequency, may have or more likely to have problems. So that's where you focus more of your attention. So, but I think those two principles, risk-based regulation and looking at outcomes, are not commonly held by most regulators. But I think that's going to be the approach that we're going to take in the United States. And so we'll see, but we'll be able to compare and contrast. Is it working better in the UK than in the US? And two countries divided by a common language. It's a fascinating natural experiment, I think.
in terms of the topic du jour right now is Kalshi. Have you been following the CFTC and Kalshi and that wormhole that they've opened up?
Yes. Yeah, I've been spending probably far too much of my time.
So as far as I understand, and I'm more of a product geek and not a regulation geek, but as far as I understand in stock trading, there is no even concept of responsible gambling. I mean, there's this vague notion of accredited investor, and accredited investors are allowed to do certain things and you can self-certify, blah, blah, blah. But in general, like Robinhood doesn't have this stuff. Webull doesn't have this stuff. Interactive Brokers doesn't have this stuff. So how do you think about, and I get this might be out of your wheelhouse a little bit, but Kalshi has opened a wormhole from sports betting to the financial markets.
Yeah.
And Kalshi's not going to have responsible gambling because they're going to be operating under a financial trading framework, and financial trading frameworks don't have this notion of responsible gambling because you're an investor and good luck to you. Yeah. Have you thought much about that world and like what's going to happen with that and how it should apply to stock trading, or should it not apply to stock trading?
Yeah, I think we've thought about this a lot. I mean, I go back to the day trading craze. Even before you could trade on your phone, there was a huge spike in day trading. So two principles, Jason. One is that the reason matters. So the reason why you're trading, investing, gambling, risk-taking matters. If you're doing it because it's funds you've set aside, it's part of what you enjoy, you're doing it for fun, or you're doing it for your business, that's a lower risk form. If you're trading, investing, gambling because you need to pay the rent tomorrow, that's not a good thing. If you're trading, investing, gambling because you're depressed, and that doing that activity takes your mind off your bad marriage, those are risk factors. So the first principle is, if risk-taking, that the reason why you're doing the risk-taking behavior, whatever that behavior is, that plays a big factor in whether or not it's going to be kind of net positive or net negative. It's not all of it, but it's a big factor. The second principle is Kalshi, Robinhood, they could all learn from the really hard lessons that the casino industry has been through in the last 30 years. In that, because this is where the casino started. 30, 40 years ago, responsible gambling was not a thing. And it was, hey, you come to our casino, you take your chances, when you lose, you leave. And in Nevada, your problems go back home with you. Over this past decades, casinos have realized that, one, there's considerable public skepticism. And two, if they want to be sustainable, if they want to be a good place to work, blah, 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 all the arguments for responsible gambling for a modern corporation make a ton of sense, especially a corporation that's consumer driven. I mean, ultimately, your customers are your lifeblood. And so the gambling industry, I think, has very smartly adapted all this modern responsible gambling, which, as you can see from the growth of the industry in the United States, has not done a thing to dent profits. It's just enabled them to expand to try and be sustainable. So I would say all those hard-earned lessons about how to help customers set limits and build sustainability and all that, the financial sector would be well advised to just beg, to just borrow. They could call it consumer protection if they wanted. They don't have to call it responsible gaming because that's a label. Create another label. Daily Fantasy could do that. Exchanges, prediction markets, a little bit of making your customers more educated, more informed, more sustainable can go a long way when you're talking to regulators, to the public, to legislators, to the press.
Can you think of any financial trading institutions that do this?
There are limits in place. There are, like you say, certifying. If you're a futures and options trader, you have to do some courses or kind of.
But you can self-certify, I think, for all that stuff. You just click yes, 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 and then you can do it.
It's still something, and that could be expanded and enhanced. They could allow users to set their own limits. Limit setting is one of the most powerful tools that a platform would offer you because it's self-generated. Like you're not, it's not the government, it's not the operator even saying, this is your maximum trade, or I don't want to trade more than 10, 50x of my deposit. But if you set that yourself, A, you're the best person placed to know what your limit should be. And B, a limit that you set yourself is much more salient than a limit that someone else imposes. So you're much more likely to say, you know what? Yeah, I don't want to go more than 100x of my initial deposit. Maybe your initial deposit's sky high. Maybe it's pretty low. But the flexible tools that we have nowadays allow almost an infinite permutation of limit settings, so you can find what's right for you. And then there's a little feedback loop. It'd be nice to know that, oh, you know what? I exceeded my limit by, every single day I traded this month, or every single day I bet this month, I exceeded that limit I told myself I wanted to set. Maybe I should set a different limit, or maybe I should tamp back down. Anyway, I think the point is, Jason, that empowering consumers is always going to be better than waiting for something bad to happen to either on an individual basis or on a societal basis, and then government, press, politicians come down on you, because the cure is almost always worse than the disease when it comes to regulation.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I feel like gambling and sports betting have they've been tarred with an unfair brush of this. It's got this kind of morality tinge to it. Like, I like to say that, everybody thinks of Tony Soprano when you talk about sports betting. And for good reason. In the United States, there was organized crime that was running sports betting and Las Vegas for a long time. So there's a lot of truth to that. But to me, the immorality of sports betting comes from the price that you're offering a customer. It's not the underlying bet itself. It's the price. Because, if everybody bet on a coin toss and got 50-50 odds, nobody would give a shit about sports betting, and there would be no regulation needed, and everybody would break even over time. But if you charge 10% every time you do a 50-50 coin toss, the person's going to lose money really, really fast. And that's why I think sports betting is unfairly maligned. My personal preference is I wish the industry, and this is my bent in the industry, I wish people would focus on the price about the sports bet and not the underlying sports bet itself. And so I think it's been tarred unfairly. Well, I think that the bad odds is immoral, and I think people shouldn't be allowed to do that. But it's not the betting that's immoral; it's the pricing that's so. It's it's equivalent to like the 3,000 APR and a credit card payment or something like that. Where if a 3% APR would be perfectly reasonable and everybody would understand it. Well, I really appreciate you stopping by. Is there anything you think we didn't touch that you have a pretty wide audience here of betting executives? You probably don't get this wide of an audience too often. Like, is there anything you want to say to them, or you think anything that they should be paying attention to that they're not?
Just that innovation, data and tech innovation is the key to this space. And that if we together, we the industry, we the operators, there are some in the vendors, there's some amazing, creative, smart, incredible people. If they take a little bit of that talent and apply it also to responsible gambling to do the next new thing, we're going to go so far. Because otherwise, if you wait, it's going to get done to you. I would just say the call is to, spend a day a year on innovation in this space. How can we build a better consumer? How can we build a better product? And how can we maximize revenue? The only way to do that is to minimize harm. So it's a dynamic balance. It's going to be different for each company, for each sector, for each society. But reaching that balance is something we all need to do. And there's some really bright minds that can chime in. There's probably stuff that we've never thought of in the responsible gambling space that a product guy, would be, oh, why don't you try this? Or how about that? That kind of innovation, I think, is coming, but there could be a lot more.
Awesome. Before I let you go, what do you want to be when you grow up?
A painter. Absolutely. I never learned how to paint with oil, and that's my retirement gig.
Get after it. Nothing's stopping you from doing it today. What are you doing after this pod? Go buy a paint and brush.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yep. We are the limits, the worst limits we place are the ones we place on ourselves.
Well, thanks for stopping by, Keith. I really learned a lot from this, and I appreciate you spreading the message and trying to make this industry better for everybody.
No, it's good stuff. Thank you, Jason.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.